Hello, and welcome to the Intermediate GMing lecture series. Today's topic is player freedom. Let's start off with the basic question of what exactly is player freedom. We're going to get a lot more into what the aspects of player freedom are that dive into the nitty-gritty, but as a baseline overall definition, player freedom is something to be looked at as the ability for players in your game to affect the game. There's a lot of different ways that this can happen, and given that Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop games are collaborative storytelling at their core, that freedom means that your players have more ability to work on that story with you. Now, one thing I want to address right off the bat is that interfering with character freedom is integral to running a campaign. There are many instances that we're going to see where, in order to keep a campaign smooth, having maximized player freedom is not always what you want. You should be very careful with where you take away freedom from your players, but you should do it with purpose, and you will need to do it in your game. So let's delve in. What are the benefits to player freedom? So let's look at this from the perspective of a player coming to your table. If a player knows that their freedom of choice in your game is respected, then that means that they're going to be a lot more able to express themselves in the game, whether that be through what character they bring to the table in the first place, or what actions that character of theirs takes. Additionally, that means that they're going to be a lot more open to creativity. The choices that they make that affect the world, when they actually are affecting the world, show the player that a more creative solution is more possible. They know that you're not trying to funnel them into any particular solution, and instead are flexible to allow for more creativity in role-playing, in problem-solving, etc. And the last major benefit is that a session doesn't need to be entirely on the DM's shoulders. A good game master does not need to carry the entire session themselves. A good game master can also rely on their players, understanding what their players are able to bring to the table, and understanding that with that idea of collaborative storytelling, that the players in your game are able to carry a good chunk of the session and allow you to lean on them more for filling in difficult gaps. Now, that doesn't mean that player freedom is entirely good, as we mentioned earlier. It's just a facet of the game that you need to work with. So what are the detriments that I bring to mind, and what you might be thinking about when we think about maximum player freedom? So if a player has 100% freedom, that means that your planning often goes out the window very quickly. If your players know that it doesn't matter what they're doing in a session, they can do whatever, and that means that it's incredibly hard to plan. Your players can go so many different ways, whereas if they have something in mind as to this is what they should probably be doing, then you can know to plan for those sorts of things and work with that. This also leads to the idea of murder hoboing. This is something that I'm sure that many of you listening and watching have experienced, or at least heard about, when a game kind of falls apart and the party just starts wreaking havoc in a town or in a tavern. This sort of thing happens when players feel completely undirected. When players have no idea what they're supposed to be doing, but they just want to have a fun time, they will cause chaos. Additionally, there's inter-party conflict, not only from things such as murder hoboing, but inter-party conflict can come around from, say, you have a campaign that is all evil characters. However, because you didn't make it clear that that's what you were looking for, one of your players brings a lawful good cleric into the party. And that means that the party is just going to have a very difficult time working together on anything, really. That's going to be a huge detriment to any sort of cohesion. And cohesion is something that is not only something that you need to keep in mind for the party, but also for your world and your game and your story. These are all things that, if your players have too much freedom of choice and movement in your world, and they don't have a solid sense of direction, Well, that means that your game is going to feel less like a campaign, and it may feel more like just a bunch of chaotic messes of sessions. And while that is something that some people enjoy, I suspect that the vast majority of people tuning into this are looking for that in their games. If we want something with more cohesion, we cannot have 100% player freedom. So let's look at where player freedom comes from in your game. Where are the places that you need to look for player freedom and where you can tweak these knobs? Now, the main three categories that I'm going to be talking about, and we'll be delving into each of these, are character creation, character action, and the events of a session and campaign. So what do I mean by character creation freedom? Character creation freedom is what your players bring to the table, what the character that they are playing. Usually, the decisions that the players have for this character creation is who is this character that they're playing? What sort of stats does this character have? What's this character's backstory? These are the basic questions that your players need to ask for their character. And these are the things that they can express themselves with. And this is where they have their freedom with their character. However, there are ways that we as GMs interfere with that and can tweak that. For example, if we have a restrictive setting, sometimes it doesn't even need to be that restrictive. Let's say that you want to have a character. Let's say your player wants to have a character that is a Twi'lek bounty hunter for the Star Wars universe, and you sit them down and you go, "Look, we're playing high fantasy. That's not going to work." Just the setting alone is a restriction on what sort of characters that your players can make. However, these are restrictions that can lead them to understand better what the limitations they have are, and a lot of the times, basic restrictions can often breed a lot of creativity. Another way is if you're just doing a quick one-shot, or if you don't want to drag your players through character creation, then sometimes you may give them pre-made characters. These pre-made characters can be very useful for just getting a game going immediately, especially in systems where character creation is a very involved process. However, that is, again, something that we take away from players. It means that they don't have a way to express themselves at the board as much as they would like. How they roleplay that character is, of course, much more flexible when we give them a pre-made character, but a lot of players do want more freedom in individually tweaking and building their character from scratch. Another thing that gets in the way of the player freedom in this stage is modules. If we disallow certain modules, then that does restrict players. For example, when I'm playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I like having the main core rulebooks, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, as well as Zenithar's Guide to Everything. And that's kind of what I work with. However, because Wizards of the Coast has not printed the Artificer class in any of those books, that is something that does restrict my players. It is really nice to be able to just have everything able to be physically looked up in books at the table, and that's something that I, as a GM, very highly value, but that is a restriction. So even if it's not a third-party module, sometimes just having extraneous stuff that's not easily accessible, so you don't have to look it up mid-combat, for example, as discluded or disallowed from your campaign, that is a restriction. And then finally, just vetoing certain types of character creation choices. We mentioned before the inter-party conflict from, for example, having one good player in a party of evil players. That's something that will be challenging, and you may wish to veto that simply due to the party conflict. Campaign conflict is another thing. If you want to have a very high fantasy adventure, and your player just wants to create a character who's just a merchant who does not go on adventuring and wants to do something with that, that's immediately at odds with the sort of adventure that you're trying to do. So another place we want to look at freedom is in character actions, and this is the one where GMs interfere the least. This is where players usually have the most freedom. And this is what actions that players immediately take at the game. This includes the actions they take in role-playing, the conversations they have, what they say. These are the combat actions they take and the skill checks they choose to take on. This is, I hit it with my sword. This is, I cast Fireball. I did not ask how big the room is, I cast Fireball. There's a ton of freedom there. That is the crux of playing most tabletop games, is that freedom of character choice in that moment. That's not to say that there aren't ways that GMs interfere with that. So what are the ways that we tweak with that sort of freedom? The first way is to take away direct control of their character. That's the most obvious way. And the most clear-cut way is, for example, if you're in Dungeons & Dragons and your party is going up against a succubus, and that succubus charms one of your players and starts giving it commands. That is going to take away immediate control from the player of their character. Another thing that's a little more subtle is when you assume actions of a player. So this is something that 99% of players that I've worked with will talk back on if you do assume an action that their character doesn't take. So a good example of this is when let's say a big portal opens and an ally of all of your party is telling them, hey guys, we gotta go through this portal to go stop the bad guy. Assuming that they all hop in the portal is a way of taking away control. And a good player, if that's something that their character would not do or needs to discuss more before hopping in, is something that they would bring up immediately or let you know when you've assumed incorrectly. But we shouldn't assume that your players will be the type to do that unless you know them well. And additionally, assuming those sorts of actions does move, it really does move forward a session, and waiting for players to choose every single action they take can slow things down quite a bit, and perhaps lean into an atmosphere of gameplay that you are not aiming for. And we will discuss atmosphere of gameplay in a future lecture. Another way that we interfere is simply invalidating actions. This is one of the biggest no-nos of GMing that I've seen. Most people will not straight up invalidate an action that a player has done directly, saying, no, you don't do that. But sometimes leading into, hey, are you sure you do that? Is also a way of interfering. Having that sort of having the GM question your action and making sure that you are positive that that is an action you want to take is a way of interfering with them, because you are putting the seed in their mind that this is something they might not want to do. This is something that you want to verify with them. And in that mere verification, you are potentially changing the outcome of the actions they are taking. And invalidating these actions just straight up and preventing them from taking place can often be seen as a clunky way to handle things. But oftentimes when players do things that are entirely inappropriate for your setting or for the party or for the table or troublesome on a larger scale, it can often be very justified. However, hopefully you don't run into those situations terribly often. And the last place I want to look into the freedom of characters, the freedom of players in a campaign is in the actual events of a session or campaign of tabletop. So how much can the players affect the trajectory of the campaign? Is your campaign set in stone? And if so, how much of it is set in stone? Do you have a campaign where you have a beginning point in mind and an end point in mind, and everything in the middle is blurry? Or do you have something that is a string of planned events? Or do you not have a trajectory in mind at all, and you just have a good start point and you just kind of let it go from there? Each of these has their own benefits and detriments, and the different levels of planning does mean that there's different levels of character freedom being taken away. So wrapped up in that is how much can your players actually affect the world that you're in and the NPCs that are around? Does the world care about the actions that they're taking? Do the NPCs around them get affected by them? Do they have plot armor? Is it impossible to kill off an important NPC too early? Are you going to basically prevent the players from doing something that their characters on paper have the ability to do? And one thing that people don't think about a lot here is the fact that adding consequences for the actions of player characters is making the world more alive, is making the world make sense, is making the world feel, in a way, more free. It's something that it's not just a dollhouse world that the players are waltzing through. This is something that is living and breathing and allows for very good back and forth for the party and you in order to create that collaborative storytelling that tabletop RPGs are all about. So how do we interfere with these session and campaign event freedom points? This is the part that most DMs will take the most freedom away from players on. This is something that definitely makes sense, however, because this is something so tied into the planning that a dungeon master does for a campaign or a session. So the main ways that we interfere are things like making certain events inevitable, making certain NPCs unstoppable, or in such a way that they will not change their mind. Let's say that there's a big warlord who's going to go to war against your friendly allies, and no matter what, the players absolutely cannot convince him otherwise, and they absolutely cannot kill him before the war happens for one reason or another, no matter how good their stats are. That is the sort of freedom interference that is often a little more subtle, makes a little more sense from a planning perspective, but can be really an unpleasant experience for the players. Having an unreactive world is something that does limit their freedom. It means that the actions that they take aren't affecting the world around them. That means that they don't actually have the collaborative storytelling say in the world of this campaign. And then finally, railroading. And let's get into railroading. So railroading is the idea of putting a campaign on rails to make sure that the party gets to the next planned point in their adventure. So railroading is something that has a terrible reputation, because railroading that is particularly bad is something that leaves a very sour taste in the players' mouths. When the players feel like they are just being ushered from one set piece to the next, it feels like they're not role-playing. It feels like you're writing a book and they're just all hostage in it. It's something that isn't all bad, though. I'm going to get into an example here shortly, but it is something that absolutely should be used sparingly. Railroading is never something that you want to lean on. Railroading is something you want to spice into your campaign to make sure that it has that extra cohesion that you need in order to make this campaign feel memorable and feel like a whole cohesive experience for your players and for you. So the place where I have the most difficulty in avoiding railroading in my GMing, and I've discovered that I should just really accept at least some quantity of railroading, is in session 1 for a campaign. I usually play in longer campaigns that are oftentimes a year or two long, and in order to kick off a campaign of that length, it requires a little bit of railroading in the beginning. So a lot of the time, after session 0, players all have created their characters, they all understand the world that they're going to be in, you bring them all to the table, and you need to make sure that all of these characters that your players have made, who may not have any connection to each other in their backstory, who may not have any unified goals, you need to make sure that by the end of that session, or the end of a couple sessions, that they have the cohesion of a team. They are ready to be a party working together. They trust each other, or at least trust each other enough to work together. But additionally, you need to make sure that they have a unified idea of what their next goal is. When players don't have a goal, that's when things start falling apart. And that's when we start getting into murder hoboing. So the party may have each other's backs, but if they don't also have each other's backs with the idea of what they are trying to do as a party, then you're going to have a difficult time making sure that they actually get through the cool content that you have developed for them, that you've planned for them. So session 1 is the part of a campaign that really does take the most effort in order to get going. It's not easy. It's not easy by a long shot. And making a good session 1 is hard without railroading. And even with railroading can still be quite a challenge. So let me give you a couple of examples of ways that I have started campaigns in session 1s to make sure that my players are all unified as a team and working toward the same goal. So there was one campaign that started with everybody in a bar. Now, this bar they were all at for different reasons. Two of the players knew each other and were traveling together, and they just stopped into the bar for directions. There's another player there whose character was in the bar, just like trying to make new friends and failing miserably at it. And then the last one was partying, celebrating a recent successful hunt that she had done. So all of these players are in this bar, and suddenly they all get attacked. And they all get attacked by assassins. The doors lock, smoke goes flying, and they all get hit with sleep arrows. Obviously, I still had them roll dice and see if they could potentially get out of the situation, but there was, in my book, no way that they were getting out without getting hit with a sleep arrow. And without this being a session 1, I probably wouldn't have taken that action, but they all woke up in a prison together. They found out that they had been captured by an evil necromancer named Zrydan, and they found out that they had all been mistaken for a party of adventurers that were a pain in the butt to the main bad guy of the campaign. And as they're finding this out and trying to convince the guards in the jail that that is not who they are, that's when the wall bursts down. A bunch of adventurers come in, take out the guards, let them out, and the party realizes they look exactly the same. So from there, the party all was unified around the goal of, well, let's go kick some necromancer butt. And they had a clear goal, and it also made them all a team in a way, given the unusual circumstances that they were all stuck in, given that they were all basically wanted by this necromancer now. Another way that I've done that is a little more simple is the most recent campaign that I've been running as of this recording. The party all got letters individually from a mysterious benefactor who asked them all to meet in one location, and he gave them a pile of money in order to meet there and start working with him towards saving the world, basically. Now, I had to make some basic assumptions that these players would all show up at the requested location if they were given a pile of money. Technically, this is something that the players could have refused, but I started off the campaign session assuming that they were all going there. And that extra level of assumption made sure that the players all actually met together and started working together on this goal. So again, railroading is not bad in little bits, but you need to take that into account with your party and how much effort you need to take in order to make this a unified team with a unified goal. So what do you actually do in order to make sure that your player freedom is balanced properly for your campaign or session? So one thing that I've mentioned a couple times now is that maintaining strong party goals is really, really important in order to prevent absolute chaos from breaking out. So all of the big horror stories that you hear about D&D and everything just falling apart is almost always because a party does not have a good idea of what they are trying to do in the long term, and then what they're trying to do in the short term in order to reach their long-term goal. These are two things that you need to make absolutely clear to your players in order to make sure that they are ready and understand what they are trying to do. If you are having difficulty figuring out what is motivating your players, then asking them what they want out of this campaign, what they want for their characters, what they want for their experience. These are questions that are very helpful to ask in session 0, but there's never a wrong time to ask these questions. These are questions that you can often ask throughout a campaign in order to make sure that your players, if they have any updates for how they're feeling about their character, really do get across to you, and you understand better what sort of things you need to be bringing to the table and allowing them to bring to the table for the campaign. If your players do take things outside of your original planned scope, don't be afraid to say, hey guys, this is not what I had planned today. Can I just take 20 minutes like in the side room, go plan out what this is going to look like now that you've gone into this dungeon that I didn't expect? Or, hey guys, you just took a turn into something huge, and I simply do not have anything planned for that. I'm going to need to call the session off early. It's almost always better to call off a session early or take a break than to try to continue through something completely unplanned, unless you are very, very good at improvising. And even then, I probably wouldn't recommend it if you want a clean, cohesive experience for your party. Another thing to keep in mind is that because consequences for actions are part of that freedom that I mentioned earlier, that also means that character death is part of that player freedom. If your world does not respond to the actions that your party is taking, even if they're stupid, even if they're foolhardy, then it's not as free as anyone needs. Making sure that character death is an option is part of ensuring basic player freedom. And sometimes you do need to take that away a little bit, or sometimes you can find a way to make it not feel so cheap. For example, I've heard stories of players having their characters killed off, but then brought back with a catch. For example, some ancient god wants them to take out some action once they are back alive. There are lots of ways to do that, but keep in mind that ultimately preventing any consequences, any big consequences for players' actions, is oftentimes not where you want to be in terms of player freedom. And then finally, a lot of the issues that we mentioned that come from having too much player freedom are often things that better players can handle much better. Somebody who has a lot of experience at the table, somebody who you have worked a lot with at the table, you can probably trust more to not bring things entirely off rails if your players lose a short-term goal. They will often look for the next short-term goal, for example, and they will rarely devolve into murder hoboing unless that's just what your friends are like, and sometimes that's what it is. So what are the raw factors that you want to keep in mind when you want to balance the freedom of your players? So the number one thing you want to be keeping in mind is, what's the player experience going to be like? Is this going to be a good experience for your players if you have this level of balance in your freedom? What is your capacity for planning? If you have a big wide open space on a map and you just tell your players to go wild and you don't have anything planned for 99% of it, that's probably not going to go well. However, if you have a solid 80% of it and you're good at improvising the rest, then you can probably actually handle that. But that is a lot of planning. Keep in mind how much you're committing yourself to when you are forming sort of the arcs of your campaign, when you're trying to figure out where your players are going next. It's very cool to have open world stuff and have your players be able to explore big wide open areas, but if you can help it, maybe hold off on letting them have access to it so quickly. Make sure you have an idea of where they're going before you actually let them loose on it if you don't have the capacity to plan the entire area that they have available. Next, you want to keep in mind your campaign style in order to determine what your player freedom balance is going to look like. If you're running a very intrigue-heavy campaign, for example, you probably want to make sure that you understand where you're taking away player freedom or where you're giving extra player freedom in a lot of your plotting and scheming that your players may be doing and with the discussions that they have with NPCs. And then finally, you want to make sure that you understand the limitations of your own improvisation skills. And there's a lot of factors for how well you can improvise certain areas. Some DMs have a lot of difficulty with improvisation, some are phenomenal at it. But no matter where you are on that spectrum, understanding the setting and the characters and really the goal that you are trying to bring your players to, or understanding what your players want out of this conversation ahead of time, that will often help your improvisation dramatically and help you balance out how much freedom you do give your players to understand better what your limitations are. So one final thing I want to bring up is that if you are in doubt of really where your player freedom lies in your campaign and whether you're maintaining a good balance of player freedom, is to ask. Your players know better than anyone else if they are having a good time. However, they're not the best at finding solutions. They are very good at pointing out problems if there are problems in your campaign, assuming you ask them and assuming they feel comfortable telling you. If you really want good, honest answers from your players, don't ask in an accusatory way. Don't ask as if you are fishing for compliments, quote unquote. Make sure that it's very clear that you want good, solid feedback. You want to make sure that they are having the best time possible, and that is why you're asking this question. And then lastly, sometimes you can't talk about your entire campaign and your plans with your players. That's usually not the best approach. There are other DMs out there. There are other resources out there online to chat with other DMs and figure out, hey, I'm thinking about X for my players. This is the setting. This is kind of what the party's been like. Do you think this is a good idea? These are powerful tools. We have more tools these days than the DMs of the 80s did. It's truly incredible, and taking advantage of that can be unbelievably helpful. Find some DMs outside of your game that you can talk to honestly about your party setup, your campaign setup, and just see if you can learn anything from that, and see if you can find if there's a problem immediately with what you're trying to do. So hopefully this was a helpful discussion for you. Player freedom is a complex topic, and I may revisit it in the future. But I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.